They built her to be unsinkable, the largest battleship the world had ever seen or would ever see again. 72,000 tons of steel. Guns the size of tree trunks. Armor thick enough to shrug off the heaviest shells afloat. She was the pride of an empire, the symbol of a nation that refused to bow, and on the morning of the 7th of April, 1945, she was ordered to sail to her death. There was only enough fuel aboard for a one-way trip. No return, no rescue, just a single brutal command. Charge through the American fleet, run aground off the coast of Okinawa, and fight until every last man was gone. The admiral who received that order despised it. He knew it was a waste of steel and blood at a time when his country could spare neither. But the emperor had spoken, and he was a loyal man to the end. What followed was 2 hours of hell. Nearly 400 aircraft against one wounded giant, boys barely old enough to shave, trapped in the dark below the waterline as the freezing sea poured in around them. By the time the smoke cleared, fewer than 300 of more than 3,000 men would still be breathing. This is the story of the final voyage of the Yamato and the men who never came home. Take a moment to settle in with a warm drink. Before we start, glance at the clock and tell us the time where you are. Then relax and enjoy another remarkable story from World War II. Take a moment to settle in with a warm drink. Before we start, glance at the clock and tell us the time where you are. Then relax and enjoy another remarkable story from World War II. The dawn broke pale and cold over the southern coast of Japan. It was the 7th of April, 1945, and the war that had once carried the empire across half an ocean was now closing in on its shore. 10 shadows stretched long across the surface of the sea, cutting through the swell in the thin light of morning. A formation, 10 warships moving as one, driving south toward a place none of them expected to leave. In the center of that formation was a giant. She was 72,000 tons of forged steel and iron will. A battleship larger than anything that had come before her, larger than anything the world would ever build again. Along her waterline lay a belt of armor 16 inches thick, enough to turn aside the heaviest shells that any enemy could throw. Her main guns were monsters, 9 barrels, so vast that a man could reach both arms deep into a single muzzle, hurling shells that weighed as much as a small car more than 20 miles across the water. Even the smaller guns bristling along her flanks were larger than the main weapons of the destroyers sailing beside her. She was the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. She was the symbol of a nation's refusal to surrender. She was the Yamato high on the bridge. Admiral Ito sat in his command chair and watched the horizon. He was a careful man, a thoughtful man, and the orders folded in his mind weighed heavier than any shell in the magazines below. The mission had a name that sounded almost holy, Operation 10 Go. The reality of it was neither holy nor kind. The entire fleet was to sail south and hurl itself directly at the American ships that were pounding the beaches of Okinawa. They were to smash through the enemy line, drive their ships up onto the sand, and fight from the wreckage until the very last man had fallen. It was not a battle plan. It was a funeral with engines. Ito despised it. He understood the arithmetic of it better than anyone. His country was bleeding out. There was barely enough steel left to build a rifle, let alone replace a battleship. To send the Yamato and her escorts on a charge they could not survive was to throw away the last of everything for nothing but the shape of honor. He had said as much quietly to the men who mattered. He had argued, and still the order had come down, stamped with the will of the emperor himself. So Ito had bowed his head and accepted it. Because he was a loyal officer, and loyalty in his world was not a feeling, It was a duty carried all the way to the grave. There was one detail that told the whole story more plainly than any speech could. When the fuel was loaded into the great ship's bunkers, there had been just enough for the journey out, not enough to come back. Some said the Navy had scraped its last reserves to give her even that much. Whatever the truth, the meaning was the same for every man aboard. This was a road that ran in only one direction. Ito knew it. He thought of his family, of the faces he would not see again, and the knowledge of it sat in his chest like a cold stone. Duty did not make the loss any lighter. It only made it silent. The morning wore on. The ships held their formation, engines humming, wakes trailing white behind them across a gray and rolling sea. For a while, at least, things were quiet. Then an officer crossed the bridge and spoke close to the admiral's ear. An American flying boat had been sighted, Farolfe, hanging at the edge of the sky. It was shadowing them. Watching, counting, Ito gave the order to open fire. A handful of anti-aircraft guns swung upward and coughed streaks of smoke into the clouds. But the distant plane slipped behind a bank of gray and was gone. Before any gunner could steady his aim, the guns fell silent. The message the plane carried had already been sent, and there was no calling it back. Ito did not flinch. He had expected to be found. A fleet this size could not hide on an open sea. And the enemy had eyes everywhere now. He simply nodded, and the ships pressed on below the bridge, far from the weight of command. The ordinary life of the ship went on. Along the vast expanse of the main deck, a young sailor stood with a few of his friends, killing time, the way young men have always killed time before a storm. He was little more than a boy, one of thousands of young men who had been fed into the machinery of the Navy in the last desperate years of the war. He did not carry the admiral's dread. Why would he? He stood on the deck of the Yamato, the mightiest warship ever to touch the water. With her under his feet, what was there in all the world to fear? He belonged to a damage control party, one of the crews, whose job it was to fight fire and flood deep inside the hull if the ship were ever hurt. It was work done in the dark, in the belly of the beast, far from the sky and the guns. For now, though, he was up top, breathing the salt air, listening to his friends laugh, feeling the deck roll gently beneath his boots. The sun climbed higher. The war felt, for one strange and peaceful hour, like something happening to other people. He watched the smaller escort ships riding the swell around the Yamato, small and gray and busy. Like children keeping close to a parent, he watched the sunlight break silver on the water. Somewhere back home there were rice fields turning green with the spring, and mothers who did not yet know where their sons were sailing. The boy did not let himself think too long about any of it. Fear was a thing you kept below deck, in the dark places, and he was not ready to go looking for it yet. He tightened the strap of his cap against the wind and told himself that whatever came, the great ship would carry them through. She always had. She was the Yamato. Nothing that flew or floated could bring her down. On the bridge, the peace did not last. A signal came in from a Japanese-held island somewhere to the south. The words that followed turned the air cold. More than 250 American warplanes had been spotted, and they were flying straight toward the fleet. Every officer on the bridge felt the number land in his gut. 250, and that was only what one island could see. The truth, though none of them knew the full shape of it yet, was worse. The Americans were launching wave after wave from their carriers, nearly 400 aircraft in all, more planes than the Yamato had guns to answer them. Every eye on the bridge turned slowly to Admiral Ito. He took a long, deep breath. There was no surprise in his face, only a kind of grim recognition This was exactly what he had known would come. It was exactly what they could not stop. The Yamato had been built in an age when battleships ruled the sea, when the greatest threat to a warship was another warship's guns across the horizon. That age was already dead, and she had been sent out to prove it one last time against a sky full of fast, nimble aircraft. All her armor and all her enormous guns were the strength of a knight in heavy plate facing a swarm of hornets. Ito made his decision without ceremony. He handed strategic command of the ship over to Captain Kosaku Aruga, the man who knew the Yamato's decks and guns as well as any living soul. Then the admiral rose, crossed to his seat, and sat back down, folding himself into a stillness that would last almost until the end. He had done what he could do. The rest belonged to the gun. And to fate, word raced through the ship like a current. Battle stations, the alarms began to blare, harsh and metallic, echoing down every passage and stairwell. On the main deck, the young sailor and his friends froze for half a heartbeat. And then, scattered, there was no more laughter now. Each of them ran for his post, boots hammering across the steel, weaving between hundreds of other men doing the same. The boy sprinted the length of the deck toward his station on the far side of the ship, his heart slamming against his ribs, the salt wind tearing at his face. All around him, the great machine of the Yamato was coming awake for war. The anti-aircraft guns rose toward the sky, dozens upon dozens of them, barrels lifting like the raised spears of an army. Gunners strapped themselves in and gripped their controls, eyes climbing the endless gray blanket of cloud overhead. Fresh ammunition was hauled up from below. Officers shouted orders that were half swallowed by the wind, and through it all, the ship kept sailing south, steady and enormous, carrying more than 3,000 men toward the fate that had been chosen for them. The young sailor reached his post and dropped down toward the lower decks, toward the damage control station where his crew would wait in the dark. He glanced back once at the open sky, at the guns straining upward, at the horizon where the clouds hung low and heavy. Somewhere behind that veil, the noise was already beginning, a low hum, distant at first, more felt than heard, like the growl of some enormous animal waking far away. The gunners heard it too. They stopped talking. Every man on the exposed deck stood frozen at his weapon, staring into the clouds, gripping cold steel, knowing exactly what that sound meant. They were listening to the approach of the angels of death, and they had already made up their minds to meet them. The humming grew louder and louder. It filled the whole sky now, pressing down on the ship, on the sea, on every straining ear. And then the clouds tore open. In a single flash, the sky filled with death. Wave after wave of American warplanes burst through the clouds, tipping over into steep dives, engines screaming as they fell toward the mighty ship. There were dozens of them, then dozens more behind those, a swarm that seemed to have no end. Fighters, dive bombers, torpedoplanes, all of them pouring down out of the gray toward the single largest target the ocean had ever offered. The Yamato answered with everything she had. The cacophony of her anti-aircraft guns rose into a single deafening roar. Streaks of shining tracer climbed into the sky by the thousand, weaving a wall of fire and steel between the ship and the diving planes. Every barrel it could reach was firing, the gunners hauling their weapons around, hammering shell after shell upward until the air itself seemed to burn. Smoke rolled across the deck. The noise was beyond anything the young men had ever heard, a physical thing that pressed on the chest and rattled the teeth and drowned out even the sound of one's own screaming. And it did almost nothing. The planes came on through the storm of lead as though it were rain. Here and there, one staggered, trailed smoke, spun away toward the sea. but for every one that fell, there were 10 more diving in behind it. The American pilots were fast, and they were brave, and there were simply too many of them. They bored straight through the wall of fire, lined up the enormous gray hull below, and opened up to the men on the deck. It did not look like an air raid at all. It looked like the sky itself had turned against them. Everywhere they looked, there were wings and smoke and the flat gray bellies of diving planes coming from every point of the compass at once, from ahead and astern, and both beams, so that no gunner could face them all and no corner of the ship was safe. The sound alone was a kind of torture, the shriek of diving engines layered over the pounding of the guns and the deep thud of bombs, until the whole world was one unbroken wall of noise with no space left in it for a human thought. Young men who had told themselves for years that they served aboard an unsinkable ship felt that belief begin to crack in the space of a single minute. Nothing here felt unsinkable. Everything here felt like the end. A hailstorm of 50 caliber bullets tore across the deck of the Yamato. The heavy rounds ripped through steel plate and sandbags, and men with the same terrible ease, throwing up sparks and splinters and, worse, ricochets screamed off the superstructure in every direction. Fragments whined through the air. Men at the exposed guns were cut down where they stood, some without ever seeing the plane that killed them. The enemy fighters roared over the ship no higher than the mastheads, so low the gunners could see the faces in the cockpits, and then they were gone, climbing away into the clouds before anyone could swing a barrel to follow. Down inside the hull, the young sailor heard it all. He had reached his post by then, deep below the main deck, a cramped damage control station buried in the belly of the ship. He shoved through the hatch and found his commanding officer already there, along with a small handful of his fellow sailors, sitting in the dim light and waiting. That was the whole of their duty, for now, to wait, to sit in the iron dark and listen while the battle raged somewhere above their heads, and to be ready to run toward the damage the moment it came. He lowered himself onto a bench beside the other. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. They simply sat and listened to the gunfire and the explosions rolling through the steel above them, feeling each concussion travel down through the frames of the ship and into their bones. It is one thing to face death when you can see it. It is another to sit blind in a locked room far below the waterline and only hear it coming. The young sailor gripped his knees and stared at the deck plates and tried to keep his breathing steady. Every crash from above made him flinch. Every muffled roar made him wonder if the next one would be the one that reached them. He thought about the men up top, the ones at the guns, his friends among them, standing in the open under all that fire. He thought about how a few hours ago they had been laughing together in the sun, and how quickly the world had folded shut around them. He looked at the faces of the men beside him in the dim light, and he saw his own fear mirrored back in every one of them. The older sailors kept their jaws set and their eyes forward, trying to look calm for the sake of the younger one, but their hands gave them away, gripping and ungripping, drumming against their knees. No one prayed out loud, no one wept. They simply endured minute by minute in the way that ordinary men have always endured the unendurable, because there was nothing else left to do and nowhere else to go. Above, the fight went on without mercy. Then a new sound joined the chaos, deeper and more enormous than all the rest. The main batteries of the Yamato had opened fire. The great guns, each one a monster built to hurl a shell, the weight of a small car, more than 20 miles, elevated as high as they could go and fired into the sky. They were loaded with a special kind of shell, a beehive round, packed with hundreds of small incendiary pellets that burst apart in a blooming cloud of burning phosphorus, meant to shred any aircraft caught inside it. When they went off, the shock waves slammed across the deck like the hand of a god, staggering men, blowing loose gear over the side, filling the air with a rain of fine burning fragments. For all their fury, the giant guns were nearly useless. They had been designed to fight other battleships across the horizon, not to swat at fast little planes skimming just above the waves. The dive bombers and torpedo planes came in low and quick, twisting and jinking, and the enormous shells could not begin to track them. The beehive rounds threw up their spectacular clouds and burned out against the empty sky while the real threat slid in underneath, untouched. The gunners loading those great weapons poured their strength into a defense that could not save them, and some part of them surely knew it. So the burden fell, as it always did, on the men at the smaller guns, the boys strapped into the exposed mounts along the deck with nothing between them and the sky. And they suffered for it beyond all telling. The strafing runs did not let up. Again and again the fighters swept in, spraying the length of the ship, and again the anti-aircraft gunners fell. They fell in droves, in whole crews at once, slumping over their weapons or thrown backward across the steel. And each time a gun went silent, other men would break from what cover they had and dash across the open. Bullets swept deck to take the dead men's places. They knew what they were running toward. They knew the odds. They ran anyway. Some of them only to be cut down in their turn a moment later, their bodies adding to the ones already sprawled across the plating. It was a kind of courage that has no reward and leaves no monument, offered up again and again in the space of a few terrible minutes. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the first attack ended. The planes simply pulled up, folded back into the clouds, and did not return. The roar of engines faded. The guns, onebewan, fell quiet. A strange, ringing silence settled over the ship, broken only by the crackle of fire and the cries of the wounded. The deck was a charnel house. Men lay scattered across the steel. Some still, some moving feebly. The plating was pocked with bullet holes and slick with blood and littered with spent brass and torn metal. A fire had taken hold somewhere in the superstructure, and black smoke curled up into the pale sky. For all that human suffering, though, one grim fact remained. The Yamato herself was barely scratched. The bullets and light bombs of that first wave had killed her sailors by the score, but they had not touched her enormous strength. She rode as steady as ever. Her engines turned. Her hull was whole. Deep inside her, the young sailor's damage control party still sat in the dark, untested, waiting, listening to the quiet return. On the bridge, Admiral Ito had not moved. Orders and reports flew around him, the captain and his officers working feverishly to put out fires, clear the dead, and ready the guns for whatever came next. Ito took no part in it. He sat in his chair, still and silent, his eyes somewhere far away. He was not frozen by fear. He was simply a man who had already read the last page of the story. He knew how this ended. He knew that no amount of courage on that deck could change the arithmetic of nearly 400 aircraft against one ship, however great. So he let Captain Aruga fight the battle, and he kept his own counsel, and he waited with the terrible patience of a man who has made his peace. The Yamato sailed on toward Okinawa. An hour passed. It was the longest and cruelest kind of hour, the kind spent knowing that the storm has not ended, only drawn breath. The wounded were carried below. The fires were fought. Fresh ammunition was hauled up to the guns that still had crews to serve them, and every man aboard kept one ear turned to the sky. For the men in the damage control party, that hour was its own particular agony. The guns had fallen silent, but silence on a ship at war is not peace. It is only waiting. They sat in the dark and listened to the muffled sounds of the crew above, dragging the dead away and shoring up what could be shored up. And they knew, all of them, that the enemy would come back. There was no version of this day that ended with the planes simply flying home and leaving the Yamato afloat. The young sailor found that the waiting was almost worse than the noise had been. In the noise there had at least been something to feel. In the silence there was only the slow, cold arithmetic of what was surely coming, and too much time to think about it. Far above them all, alone with his thoughts, Admiral Ito sat and did not move. Perhaps he thought of the men dying on his deck, boys who had trusted the Navy that sent them here. Perhaps he thought of the country that had ordered this, spending its last great ship the way a desperate man empties his pockets. Perhaps he thought only of home. Whatever passed behind his silent face, he kept it there, and he waited, as they all waited, for the sky to open again. Then the sound came again, that low, growing rumble of engines swelling behind the clouds, and every heart on the ship sank at the sound of it. The second attack fell upon the Yamato with all the fury of the first, and worse, fighters and dive bombers tipped over out of the gray and screamed down. And once more the deck erupted in tracer and smoke and blood, but this time there were fewer men to answer them. The gunners who had fallen in the first wave could not all be replaced. Whole mount stood silent now, their crews gone, and there was no one left to climb into the blood-slicked seats and take up the fight. One by one, the voices of the anti-aircraft guns went quiet, not because the ammunition had run out, but because the men were gone, and this time the Americans had not come only to strafe down low over the water. So low their propellers seemed to skim the wave tops. The torpedo bombers came sliding in. They pressed in closer than seemed possible, ignoring what fire the ship could still throw. And then one after another they released their long steel fish into the sea. The torpedoes struck the water and ran straight and true toward the vast gray flank of the Yamato. On the bridge, Captain Aruga saw them coming and roared for evasive maneuvers. The great rudder swung. The enormous ship began ponderously to turn, but a battleship of 72,000 tons does not dodge. She was too vast, too slow to answer the helm, and the torpedoes were too many and too close. The American pilots had learned their trade well, and they concentrated their attacks again and again against the same side of the ship, the port side, so that every hit would pull her the same way, and none of the damage would balance out. It was a cold and brilliant kind of cruelty, and it was exactly the right way to kill a ship like her. A single torpedo, even two or three, the Yamato could have shrugged off and lived. Her designers had built her to survive terrible punishment, to keep fighting with great wounds torn in her sides. But no ship, however mighty, could survive being struck over and over in the same place, dragged always in the same direction, until the sea itself began to climb inside her and would not stop. Each new explosion against the port side sent a shudder through the whole vast length of her, and each one tilted her a little further, a slow and terrible leaning that every man aboard could feel, now in the slope of the decks beneath his feet. The great ship was being pulled down not by any single blow, but by the patient, murderous repetition of them deep in the hull. The young sailor's ordeal was about to begin. The order came down for his damage control party to move deeper into the ship. He rose with the others and followed his commanding officer down through the narrow passages and steep ladders, down past the point where the daylight had any meaning at all, to the second lowest deck, 6 of them in all, descending into the groaning dark. All around them the ship shuddered and creaked and boomed, each torpedo strike sending a great shock wave rolling through the hull, the steel itself seeming to cry out under the blows. At the bottom of the ladder, his commanding officer stopped and gave an order. 2 of the men were to go down further still, into the very lowest deck, to search for damage and report back. The young sailor watched as two of his companions, boys like himself, swung open the heavy hatch in the deck at their feet, climbed down into the black space below, and pulled the hatch shut over their heads. And he would remember the sound of that hatch closing for the rest of his life. At almost the same instant, up in the daylight, a wave of torpedo bombers dropped their payloads and pulled away. The captain's order for evasive maneuvers came too late and meant too little. The torpedoes ran home. A massive bang reverberated through the entire ship, a blow so heavy it seemed to lift the deck beneath the sailors' feet. The lights went out. Absolute darkness swallowed the compartment, and then came a sound worse than any explosion, the roar of the sea itself, as water came surging up through the hatch that his two companions had just closed behind them. It gushed into the passage in a black flood, freezing and violent, rising with terrible speed. The young sailor stumbled in the pitch dark. He could see nothing at all, only feel the icy water climbing up his legs, past his knees, past his waist. The cold of it drove the breath from his lungs. He threw out his hands and groped along the cold steel walls, searching for a way up, for the ladder, for anything. His fingers found only smooth, wet metal and the hard edges of frames and pipes. The water reached his chest. Men were shouting somewhere near him, their voices high and cracking with panic, calling out names, calling out for help that no one could give, and he could not tell his own voice from theirs. He thought of the two men who had gone down through the lower hatch only a moment before, and he understood with a horror that turned his blood to ice that they were already gone, sealed into the flooded dark below with no light and no way back. The flood kept rising. His boots left the deck, and then he was no longer standing at all, but treading water in a flooding steel box far below the surface of the sea, in total darkness, with the ceiling coming down to meet the rising water and the last of the air running out in the narrowing space between them. This was how men died on a sinking ship, not gloriously, not in the light, but drowning in the black, trapped in a room they could not find their way out of. And then, when there was almost nothing left to hope for, something changed. A faint, weak light appeared above them. The pressure of the trapped air, or some strange mercy of the flooding, had pushed the hatch to the deck above slightly ajar, and through that narrow gap came a thin sliver of gray daylight. It was the most beautiful thing the young sailor had ever seen. The men still living in that drowning compartment swam toward it with the last of their strength, fighting the current. Reaching up, they pushed against the hatch, forcing it open against the weight above, and hauled themselves up through the gap, one after another, scrambling out of the flood, mere moments before the last pocket of air vanished beneath them. They pulled the hatch shut behind them, gasping, soaked, half-drowned, only to watch in horror as seawater began to shoot up through the seals of the very hatch they had just escaped through. Thin jets of it hissed into the compartment under enormous pressure. Below them, the sea was rising still, and it was hunting them upward through the ship, deck bideck, desperate, and certain the hatch was about to burst apart entirely and let the ocean in all at once. They cast about for anything they could use to hold it shut, anything to brace it, anything to buy a few more minutes of life. Their hands were shaking. Their clothes hung heavy and freezing against their skin. The deck under their feet was no longer level, tilting further with every passing moment, so that even standing had become a fight against the slow, sickening lean of the dying ship. And still the water came hissing through the seals, pulling around their boots, rising. There was nowhere in all that great vessel that the sea could not reach. Now, they had climbed one deck higher and bought themselves a handful of minutes, and those minutes were already draining away beneath them. But it was already far too late, for the Yamato, the great ship, was mortally wounded. The torpedoes had done exactly what the American pilots had intended, striking again and again along her port side until the water pouring into her could not be balanced or pumped away. She was taking on the sea by the thousands of tons. She was beginning to list, tilting steadily over toward her wounded flank. And there were no longer enough living men aboard to save her. The gunners were dead. The damage control parties were drowning at their posts. And somewhere in the depths of the ship, a temperature was climbing toward a number that would decide the fate of everyone still aboard. Deep in the forward part of the ship, in a compartment few of the crew ever saw, a needle was climbing. The forward magazine, where the great shells and their charges were stored, was growing dangerously hot. Fire was spreading toward it through the wounded hull. And if the heat reached the powder, the Yamato would not simply sink. She would tear herself apart in an instant and take every living soul aboard with her. Word of it reached the bridge, and Captain Aruga gave the only order that could be given: flood the forward magazine, drown the powder before the fire could reach it. It was the standard measure, the thing every officer was trained to do, but the answer that came back to him was the answer of a ship already dying. The pumps were inoperable. The systems that should have flooded the magazine were smashed or without power or already underwater. There was no way to do it. There was no way to stop what was coming. Aruga stared out through the bridge windows at the tilting sea and the smoke and the circling plane. He was an exhausted man, and now he was a defeated one. He had fought his ship as well as any captain could have fought her, and it had not been enough, and there was nothing left to try. The Yamato was leaning hard to port now, her deck sloping like a hillside, and she was not going to right herself again. It was all over. He knew it in his bones. He gave the order, abandon ship, and it was then, at last, that Admiral Ito moved. Through the whole long ordeal he had sat silent in his chair, a still point in the middle of the storm, saying nothing, letting his captain fight the battle to its bitter end. Now he rose to his feet. He steadied himself against the tilt of the deck, and he spoke, and the men on the bridge turned to hear the first words he had offered since the fighting began: cancel the operation. He said, return to port after rescuing the men. It was a strange and quiet kind of mercy, spoken over a ship that could no longer obey any order at all. Operation Tengo was finished. There would be no glorious charge, no beaching on the shores of Okinawa, no last stand from the wreckage. There was only the sea and the dying, and whatever men could still be saved. A signalman turned and ran from the bridge to carry the new orders to the other ships of the fleet, to tell them the mission was over, and the living should be gathered up. Then Admiral Ito did a small and human thing. He thanked the men on the bridge. He thanked them for their service, for their courage, for everything they had given, and then, calm and unhurried, he turned and walked from the bridge and made his way to his cabin. And he did not come out again. He had made his peace with the sea long before this day, and he meant to keep his own counsel to the end, and to go down with the ship he had been given to command. Captain Aruga dismissed the men who remained around him. Save yourselves, he told them. Abandon ship. He himself would not leave. Like his admiral, he had chosen to stay with the Yamato and share her fate, and no argument would move him. The men who had served under him scattered to spread the word and to try, in the little time that was left, to live. Below the deck, the young sailor and his crew were still fighting their hopeless fight against the flooding hatch. They had jammed a beam between the hatch and the roof above it, bracing it with all their strength. A desperate and futile attempt to hold back an ocean. It would not have held for long. It did not matter. Their commanding officer, looking at the tilting deck and the rising water and the darkness, understood at last that there was nothing left to save. He turned to his men and shouted the order that set them free, everyone up. They abandoned the beam and the hatch and the flooded compartment and ran up the ladders, through the passages, climbing toward the daylight as the whole world leaned further and further beneath them. When the young sailor finally burst out onto the open deck, he emerged into a scene torn straight from a nightmare. The guns had stopped firing. The great weapons that had roared all morning stood silent now, their crews dead or fled. Men were leaping over the side into the sea. The wounded lay where they had fallen, some being tended by their comrades, others simply left past all help. And through it all, the Yamato was rolling, tilting further and further onto her port side. The whole enormous vessel slowly, ponderously, beginning to lie down in the water. His officer gave one last order: throw over anything that floats. The men obeyed, hurling logs and mats and hammocks and loose timber into the sea. Anything a drowning man might cling to. The port railing dipped beneath the waves. The waterline began to climb up over the deck itself as the starboard side rose higher and higher into the air. The whole ship turning onto her side like a great wounded animal settling down to die, just standing, had become a battle. The smooth steel deck had become a slope, slick and steep, and the young sailor felt his boots begin to slide out from under him, felt himself starting to slip down toward the hungry sea. This was the moment. There would be no other. He and the men around him made their choice together, the only choice left. It was time to abandon ship. He ran to the stern, to the high side, still lifting out of the water, and he jumped. The sea came up to meet him, cold and dark and streaked with oil. He plunged under and kicked hard for the surface, fighting toward the light above. But the Yamato was not finished with him yet. Her great propellers were still turning beneath the water, vast bronze blades churning the sea, and the current they made reached out and seized him. He was dragged down, spun helplessly into the whirlpools boiling off the dying ship, pulled deep beneath the surface with no more power to resist it than a leaf caught in a river. And above him, the Yamato reached her end. The wrecked and burning battleship rolled completely onto her side and kept rolling, turning over as men still leapt from her enormous guns tearing loose from their mountings and crashing down into the waves. And then the fire found the forward magazine. The explosion was beyond all imagining. The forward part of the great ship detonated in a single catastrophic instant, hurling a column of fire and smoke miles into the sky. The blast was so enormous that it was seen from the mainland of Japan itself, far over the horizon, a towering mushroom of smoke rising from the sea where the pride of the Imperial Navy had been. In that one moment, most of what remained of the more than 3,000 men aboard were gone. The young sailor did not see it. He was still deep beneath the surface, tumbling in the black water, his lungs burning, certain he was about to become one more body, lost in the deep. And then, somehow, the whirlpool released him. He fought upward with the last of his strength and broke through into the air. Gasping, alive, he surfaced into a drowned and broken world. He was disoriented, dizzy, half choked with oil and seawater. All around him, great black columns of smoke rose into the sky. A film of oil floated thick on the surface, and everywhere he looked he could see men, some swimming, some floating and not moving at all. Scattered across the heaving sea, he was one small living thing in the middle of a vast graveyard. Close by, he saw a group of survivors clinging to a raft, and he swam to them. And they pulled him in. There was nothing to do then but hold on and drift and wait and hope that someone would come before the cold and the sea took what the guns had not. 2.5 hours later, someone came, a Japanese destroyer, one of the few escorts still afloat, edged in among the wreckage and the oil, and began pulling men from the water. The young sailor was lifted from the raft and hauled aboard, soaked and shaking and utterly spent, but breathing. He had lived. He was one of the fortunate few of the more than 3,000 men who had sailed aboard the Yamato that morning. Fewer than 300 were pulled living from the sea. All the rest were gone, taken down with the ship or lost in the water. The young sailor survived the war, and in time he went home to his family, carrying with him the memory of that day for the rest of his life. Admiral Ito and Captain Kosaku Aruga were not among the saved. Both of them, as they had chosen, went down with the ship. Operation Tengo was a total catastrophe. Of the 9 warships that had escorted the Yamato, 5 were sunk alongside her that day, and a 6th would go down later from her wound. Almost nothing was gained, and almost everything was lost. It would stand as the last great naval operation Japan ever launched before the end of the war. The final futile charge of a navy that had once ruled an ocean. The largest battleship ever built had been sent out to die, and she had done exactly that, along with thousands of the young men who believed she could not be sunk. And on the mainland, those who saw that towering pillar of smoke rise from the southern sea understood, even before the word came, that something vast had ended and that it was not coming back.